Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 22. This time we head back into Gothic territory with a tale of cruelty and revenge set during the Franco-Prussian War, the Lord of Chateau Noir. And here's Paul to introduce the story.
In late 1870, the Franco-Prussian War entered its second phase. The empire of Napoleon III has been defeated, and the French have declared a third republic and refused to capitulate to the Prussians. Paris is besieged, and northern France remains a battleground. In the occupied Norman town of Les Andelys, Prussian sentries are regularly found dead, while foraging parties and patrols have disappeared. The nearby Chateau Noir seems to be central to these events, and Captain Baumgarten is sent to investigate.
Mm-hmm. So the story was written in spring 1894, but as we'll see, it has many connections back to Conan Doyle's school days at Stonyhurst, the Jesuit college just outside Preston in northwest of England. And when the Franco-Prussian War broke out in July 1870, Conan Doyle was in his first year at the school and recorded the incident in a letter to his mother, saying that the news of the war was so momentous that it had, quote, made a ripple even in our secluded backwater. And Conan Doyle was naturally predisposed to taking the French side, partly because of his mother's love of the French language and literature, but also because Stonyhurst was, of course, a Catholic college and supported Catholic France over the Protestant Prussia. And Owen Dudley Edwards has written about the profound influence of one of the Stonyhurst tutors and priests, Father Cassidy, on the schoolboys, and suggested that Cassidy might have made much of the cruelty of the Prussians towards the demoralised and shattered French population, though, of course, a lot less would have been said about the siege of Paris and the Commune and its anti-clerical elements. And certainly Conan Doyle was anxious about the plight of the French, because in another letter he wrote, "I'm so sorry for poor old France, which, though I don't hear very much war news, still is I hear getting beaten. The most frightful prophecies are going about. About her I hope they are all lies." But Conan Doyle was also hoping that Britain might be brought into the conflict, and recalling the events many years later, he noted that in spite of a large infusion of foreigners and some disaffected Irish, we, the schoolboys, were a patriotic crowd, and our little pulse beat time with the heart of the nation. But Britain wasn't pulled into the conflict, but it wasn't long before Conan Doyle himself was on the continent, because 5 years later he studied in Feldkirch in Austria at another Jesuit school, and it's there that he developed a sympathy for the peoples of Germany and Central Europe. And it's this love of both the French and the German that is something that colours the Lord of Chateau Noir. As for the writing of the story, this was one of several occasional articles by Conan Doyle for The Strand after the demise of Sherlock Holmes, and he may well have been inspired by reading Maupassant, as we'll come on to in a little bit. But whatever the inspiration, we have a letter from Conan Doyle to his mother dated the 2nd of May 1894, in which he writes, "I wrote a fine story, The Lord of Chateau Noir, a real clinker. I sold it to an American for £150. It will appear in The Strand. Also an article on ski, which is adorned with photos of my own taking." And it did appear in the UK in The Strand magazine in July 1894, with illustrations by William B. Wallen, the great Gerard illustrator. And it was published alongside An Alpine Pass on Ski, which was Conan Doyle's article of his trip to Switzerland in March 1894, around the time that the story was written. And the story was indeed widely circulated in the American newspapers in July of 1894, and eventually collected in the UK in the Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport in 1900. And the story was indeed very fondly remembered, at least by one significant figure in Conan Doyle's life, Herbert Greenhouse Smith, the editor of The Strand. And in 1930, Greenhouse Smith wrote an obituary and a defense, to some extent, of Conan Doyle's life and work, and said, I have even seen him alluded to as, quote, a writer of stories for boys. To me and to others like me, this opinion seems to be, not to put too fine a point on it, the last word in nonsense. To my way of thinking, such stories as The Leather Funnel or The Lord of Chateau Noir have never been excelled by any writer in the world. No, not by Kipling or Stevenson or Maupassant or Anatole France. Stories for boys indeed. Foh. And even the great Owen Dudley Edwards singles this story out for praise, describing it as one of the very greatest pieces of historical fiction Conan Doyle ever wrote, a dark, symbolic narrative of ancient aristocratic leadership of guerrilla activity against the Germans. So before we get too far into it, let's get a bit of background on the Franco-Prussian War itself.
Yeah, the war had been brewing for quite some time, really. It all came about as essentially part of Otto von Bismarck's plan for a greater Germany, and for Germany to become the dominant nation within Europe. Even though in the mid-19th century Germany hadn't yet united, it was a number of disparate states. Bismarck's ambition was to essentially unify Germany with Prussia as the leading state of Germany. And to this end, he had provoked wars with Denmark in the 1860s and Austria, who up to that point were the leading German-speaking nation in Europe. Provoked wars with both of those, won them both. And the next target was France. Throughout the summer of the early spring and summer of 1870, Bismarck was provoking the French, and the flashpoint came over the succession to the Spanish throne, where the French objected to the Prussian idea of a Hohenzollern princeling to become king of Spain, and this was exaggerated. And in the end, there was a telegram known as the Ems telegram, which Bismarck apparently doctored in such a way to become the language was very offensive to the French, and Napoleon III and the French Second Empire ended up declaring war on Prussia in July 1870. The Prussians moved into France. There were a series of battles throughout July and August of 1870, most of which the Prussians won. It culminated in September the 2nd, 1870, with the surrender of the French Imperial Army at Sedan and the collapse of the French Second Empire. This was replaced by the Third Republic, and France kept fighting. So the Prussians then had to keep their war machine moving. They besieged Paris and moved their armies further west and north in France, and a number of battles and occupations carried on throughout this period. One of the areas they'd moved into was Normandy. And there's a town in Normandy called Les Andelys, which is where this story is set, and it had personal connections to the Doyle family.
Yeah, it did. And Alexis Barquin at the Conan Doyle Encyclopedia has done a really great piece of work in digging through the family connections here. In autumn 1870, Conan Doyle's sister Annette was educated at Saint Clotilde, a boarding school for girls in Les Andelys. And his sister Lottie also went to the same school about a decade later. And it may be that his mother, Mary Doyle, was educated there too. It's a bit ambiguous as to whether or not she studied there. Conan Doyle himself visited the town several times, being hosted by Madame Ricard. And in 1959, on what would have been Conan Doyle's 100th birthday, she was interviewed. And thanks to Alexis, we have both the interview and a translation, which you can find at the Conan Doyle encyclopedia. We'll put a link in the show notes. But Les Antilles gets referenced in 3 other Conan Doyle tales. There's a Seigneur d'Andelys in The White Company, Saint-Marie, who is a noble in The Refugees, is also Seigneur of the Chateau d'Andelys. And probably most significantly, the Hussar of Conflans camped just outside Andelys in The Marriage of the Brigadier, which is the story in which Gerard narrowly escapes being impaled on the horns of a rampaging bull.
Yeah, so it's particularly interesting that Annette was in the town of Les Andelys during the period of German occupation, and she actually wrote letters to her parents, Charles and Mary Doyle, from Les Andelys during this period, and they published extracts from these letters anonymously in the Scotsman, a kind of voice from within France during the war kind of thing. Annette unfortunately died young in 1890. But it's interesting to speculate as to whether Arthur got a chance to talk to her about what it was like
Mm.
living in France during the war and the occupation of this period. If he had access to the full letters
Mm.
that she'd written to their parents and used this as research material to get the atmosphere right for the story.
Yes, and we know he was very interested in the history of the war because he owned a copy of Cassell's illustrated history of the war as well.
Yeah, we know this from a letter that he wrote to his mother in 1875, talking about he has a gift for his sisters. He says, "Tell Lottie and Connie I have a present for them. It is a lot of numbers of Cassell's illustrated history of the war, i.e., the Franco-Prussian War.
Mhm.
The pictures ought to amuse them." And the Castle's illustrated history of the war, as it suggests, it is this wonderful 2-volume compendium full of wonderful line drawings that really atmospheric pictures of the period, and but it does seem a curious present to give to a couple of young girls.
Well, he might have been warning them that they were going to study there anytime soon, I suppose. But
Or,
yeah,
or perhaps he said this is what Annette was living through, or
yeah,
something like that, and of course Lottie was herself going on to study in Les Andelys later.
yeah, yeah. The scans are fantastic. Actually, there are some.
Mm.
I'll put some of the links into the show notes because the illustrations from that work are really fantastic. And the historical context of this story is very specifically this second phase of the Franco-Prussian War. So, what was distinct and different about that?
Well, what you've got in the second phase is you've got a change of government in France into a republican government, and a more or a different sort of strident nationalist government to the imperial government. When the war broke out, the French army was essentially made up of 4 different elements. The main element of which was the regular army, the Metropolitan Army, which had been involved in the wars which the Second Empire had fought in the 1850s and onwards. So I'm thinking of things like the Crimean War,
Mm,
or the wars in Italy in 1859, and the Mexican adventure of the 1860s as well, the colonial adventure. They were the Imperial Army, the regular army was the backbone, and that was backed up by the Armée d'Afrique, which was the army which had been raised after France's invasion and occupation of Algeria and areas of North Africa.
mm,
So that element you've also got, as well as French troops. You've got North African troops, like the Zouaves and the Turcos, the Tirailleurs Algériens, the Spice,
mm,
all
mm,
these sort of units. This is the army that is eventually defeated at Sedan in September 1870 and largely taken into captivity. So a whole swathe of French troops are taken out by that. But the regular army had been backed up by the Garde Mobile, which tended to consist of men of fighting age who hadn't actually been conscripted, and they were used for things like garrison duty, fortress duty, that sort of thing. And then After them, the Garde Nationale, which has its roots back in the early days of the French Revolution in the 1790s, and the old levée en masse, and was largely originally a middle class sort of backup army, but there were all sorts of elements made that up, and the regular army regarded that with a degree of contempt. And then finally, you got the group known as the Francs-Tireurs, who really start out with local rifle volunteers, and the plan for the Francs-Tireurs was to use them for hit and run, partisan operations, that sort of thing. The only units of French soldiers who actually got into Germany in the Franco-Prussian War were a small unit of Francs-Tireurs
Oh,
who created a small degree of chaos and stole some German pontoon boats and brought them back to France. But the Francs-Tireurs later got a very bad name, because once, as is the case with these things, once war breaks out, a certain degree of discipline is lost.
yeah.
And it wasn't helped by the more sort of bloodthirsty, fulminating politicians who love to stir this kind of thing. Michael Howard, in his history of the Franco-Prussian War, mentions one in particular. He says, at Tours, Francois Steenackers suggested the formation of small groups which will cut off convoys, harass the enemy, and hang from trees all the enemies they can take, well and truly by the neck, after having mutilated them. In short, I suggest the type of war which the Spaniards waged against us under the First Empire and the Mexicans under the Second. So you've got all this kind of bloodthirsty rhetoric is going on. And it's interesting as well, this kind of throwback to the original Napoleonic Wars hangs over this, interestingly, and German memories and French memories of that war become involved. And Howard notes a conversation between the French politician Jules Favre and Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck says of these Francs-Tireurs, "We are hunting them down pitilessly," Bismarck told Jules Favre. "They are not soldiers. We are treating them as murderers." And when Favre pointed out that the German people had done the same in the wars of liberation, i.e. the wars against Napoleon, 1813 and 1814, Bismarck replied unanswerably, "That is quite true, but our trees still bear the marks where your generals hanged our people on them." So once this sort of war starts and this sort of rhetoric, things get a bit out of hand. And it's interesting from the Castle's history of the war between France and Germany, the one that Arthur Conan Doyle gave to his sisters. There's a comment on that on the Germans in the northeast in Picardy and Normandy. It is said that the Prussians discovered in a wood near Dieppe the body of one of their comrades tied by his heels to the branch of a tree, with his eyes gouged out and his nose and ears cut off. So these sort of stories are doing the rounds quite definitely. But the writer of the Castle's history also says, of the conduct of the Prussians themselves in Normandy, various accounts are given, but on the whole, it seems probable that they behaved with no greater rigour than military exigencies required. So there is a balanced view also being given. But this is the background of the story. Conan Doyle's read up on all of this material, and of course he's also at this time very steeped in the original Napoleonic Wars and interested in the Peninsular War and the guerrilla war that went on there. And he throws this all into this story, The Lord of the Chateau Noir, and turns it into a very interesting historical Gothic story.
And I hadn't realised until you were talking about the Francs-Tireurs that Conan Doyle would go on in later life to recommend volunteer rifle regiments as a preparation for war.
Possibly looking at the way the French had taken this idea. I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't recommend outright kind of partisan warfare turning into terrorist warfare, but certainly the idea of using riflemen, the original idea of using riflemen to harass occupying troops and this sort of thing would be very appealing to him.
Yeah.
And of course he'd been out or later he was out in the Boer War, where the mounted rifleman was the king of battle.
Yeah, and that point you make about the interpretations of the violence or the cruelty of the French side and of the German side is something that carries through right through to the present day. It's still hotly debated by historians and of the period. I was reading an article that only came out 4 or 5 years ago by Bastian Sciana, which was looking at reviewing German behavior during the Franco-Prussian War, and he was putting this in the context that there's been a strong element of the historiography since the Second World War to sort of track back this idea of an innate German militarism to earlier conflicts, which has been largely dismissed now. But what he concludes is that the Franc-Tireur probably weren't quite as extensive as we might think, and probably not quite as effective. But also as much as there were incidents and there was a great deal of exaggeration on their side, the Germans were operating, just as that quote indicates from Castle's history, within the sort of bounds of what was fairly normal for a 19th century army. But that is something that this whole issue of the cruelty on either side is something that carries all the way through to the literature, as we're going to come on to and to see when we talk about Maupassant.
Yeah, it's as ever with this sort of warfare, it becomes propagandized. Stories become exaggerated, and also when you unleash, as quoting from the politician Steenackers, when these sort of rather irresponsible politicians shout about unleashing this sort of warfare, they also encourage, as ever, the criminal elements. Who always go on the back of these things and are out for themselves. You got this as well with the Peninsular War, where the guerrillas, you get the genuine patriots, and then you get people who are in it for themselves, and they will also take advantage. But with the Franco-Prussian War, you've got an extra level of complication because you've got something which is developing into a civil war.
Yes,
in Paris. So almost in a way, the partisan war of the Franc-Tireurs becomes overshadowed later on by the horrors that happen in Paris. The French unleash on each other, where the conservative Versailles troops are unleashed on the Commune in Paris, and just it becomes a bloodbath. The Prussians just stand and they're just spectators to Frenchmen killing each other. So that whole thing overshadows the earlier stages of the Franco-Prussian War, and certainly in a lot of the French national memory, and still stirs up passions to this day.
Yeah. Now, the violence that surrounds the Franco-Prussian War is something that we inevitably see feeding into the literature of the period, and probably the author most associated with the Franco-Prussian War is one with whom Conan Doyle was very well acquainted, and that's Guy de Maupassant. And Maupassant wrote a collection of short stories entitled Boule de Suif et autres contes de la guerre, or Dumpling and Other Stories of the War. The title one, Boule de Suif, is by far the most famous and quite possibly, one of the best short stories written in any language. It's an incredible piece of work, and it really concerns a cross section of French society who are in a cab seeking to pass a Prussian roadblock, and essentially the occupants sell out the most humane member, who happens to be a prostitute, and essentially she is forced to sleep with a Prussian officer so that they can get through and get on their way. And it's a very taut psychological study in this pressure cooker environment of the cab, but also the coaching house that they stay in overnight. And it's a really amazing piece of work. But in this and other stories by Maupassant, he really paints the picture of the German soldiers, very negative view of the German soldiers, as you would expect, depicts them as dull, slow-witted, morally dubious, and in the case of Boule de Suif, sexual predators as well. And that features in other stories as well. There are Mademoiselle Fifi, about an effeminate German officer who abuses a Jewish prostitute, who then kills him, and then Two Friends, which tackles the subject in a different way, where two friends meet, debate the tragedy of the Franco-Prussian War before being captured and ultimately executed by the Prussians. And while Conan Doyle doesn't make any specific references to Boule de Suif or the wider collection in his letters, it's inconceivable that he wouldn't have read these tales, which were hugely popular and influential. We know he'd read an awful lot of Maupassant, presumably in the original French. In one letter to his mother, he refers to Pierre et Jean, a work of 1888, saying that the preface is by far the best part of it. The preface being a very famous essay entitled The Novel, Le Roman, in which Maupassant argues that there can't be a common definition of what a novel is. And he uses the examples of Don Quixote and Madame Bovary and the Three Musketeers, all of which were right up Conan Doyle's street. And Conan Doyle has this very, complex relationship with Maupassant. It's fair to say that he was deeply in awe of him, but also desperately uncomfortable with some of the subject matter. And he wrote an article that was later incorporated into Through the Magic Door, in which he wrote, Maupassant, with all his faults of taste, was such a natural instinctive storyteller, so concise, so admirably balanced, with such a range of sympathies. Of the great masters of fiction, none, perhaps, combined high imagination with actual knowledge of life so fully as he. Some of his tales are, I grant, indefensible, but a French writer is to be judged by the standard of his own country, and it may at least be said of him that he is never coarse for the sake of coarseness, and that the humour or the drama of the situation is its excuse, if not its justification. Hesketh Pearson puts it a bit more on the nose and says, of course, Maupassant, being French, was obsessed with sex, while Doyle, being more English than the English, was obsessed with sport. Although he does make the nice connection that there is a Conan Doyle and Maupassant both passed through the Gemmi Pass in Switzerland at many years apart and actually hit on the same idea for a short story. And that Conan Doyle recounts that in an article for The Strand called Stranger Than Fiction. But Conan Doyle was at this time, we know he was reading Maupassant around this time, and he had very good reason for reading Maupassant and lots of other French writers.
Yeah, this time he was caught up in a controversy surrounding George Moore's novel Esther Waters, which had been essentially banned from W.H. Smith stalls on moral grounds. Doyle thought this was completely wrong, and he defended the novelist's right here. And Doyle was one that he would draw the line. And this was one of his main points, really. There is a line to be drawn, but there must also be a certain degree of artistic freedom. And this possibly came from him being more familiar with continental literature, and particularly French literature, than a lot of his British contemporaries were. And I mean, he himself would certainly draw a line at a certain point in a letter to his mother written about this time. He says about that Zola and Maupassant and Gautier get beyond me, i.e. they cross a line at points that he thinks is going too far. He probably also just thinks, well, they are French, but that's not what we should do. And if he felt that Moore had crossed the line with Esther Waters, he wouldn't have defended it. So he's we have this popular image of Conan Doyle as being, the sportsman, the Scots Irishman who was more English than the English, with his big imperial moustache, and it has this sort of caricature of Doyle is accepted, and this his approach to this sort of literature shows that he was a far more complex character and extremely well read.
Yes, incredibly well read. Incredibly well read.
The other thing I would bring in, certainly in the context of our current discussion, with Lord of the Chateau Noir being set in Normandy, that interestingly, de Maupassant was a Norman writer. And just to further what you were saying, Mark, there about Doyle's opinion of de Maupassant, in Through the Magic Door, he does class de Maupassant as second only as master of the short story to Edgar Allan Poe, which from Doyle is praise indeed.
Yes, I mean, he singles out in particular Maupassant's The Hauler, which we'll undoubtedly come back to when we eventually cover The Parasite.
I think the other thing we need to say about Doyle in this context as well is look at his own writings, and it does come back to the quote that you gave earlier from Greenhouse Smith about how Doyle is not to be dismissed as simply a boys' writer. Again, the thing he took from reading a lot of these French writers is this sort of dark irony
Yes.
and moral dichotomy, which comes into so many of his stories. I'm thinking in particular of stories um, like Lord of the Chateau Noir, Case of Lady Sannox, The Retirement of Senior Lambert,
Mm, mm.
and also you look at some of the Sherlock Holmes stories where you've got this same sort of moral dichotomy and dark irony going on in stories like the Speckled Band and the Abbey
Yeah.
Grange,
Yeah.
where there are serious issues of morality,
Mm.
which are looked at from a very left field perspective almost.
Yeah. Yes, and there's almost an element to which Conan Doyle is playing against, well, what we would now think of sort of genre norms. And I was thinking about this when reading Chateau Noir again, in that, without giving away the ending at this stage, it doesn't play out the way that you would expect a Gothic telling of this story to play out.
I mean,
Um,
the ending is interesting in that there's no real close. You don't know what it's almost open for a sequel.
yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. So we've got the influence there of French literature, but we've also got the sort of long shadow of Gothic literature, or literature that's very much in that sort of vein.
Yeah. So again, at the time this story has been written, just to come back briefly to the French element, that there's a certain style of story known as the conte cruel, which
Mm,
aren't necessarily Gothic, but are dark and ironic tales, and that the master of this was Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. But you've also got in Lord of the Chateau Noir that sort of element, but mixed together with a more traditional Gothic element.
mm,
The story itself, when Captain Baumgarten takes his patrol to investigate the Chateau Noir,
mm,
straight away the name of the chateau gives you a clue. They're going through driving rain towards this dark chateau. Um, and when they get in there, there's it's deserted. This is classic horror movie stuff,
mm,
almost walking into this deserted medieval chateau, and the language used within it when Baumgarten is sat on his own in the dining room. He sat within a small circle of brilliant light, but outside that circle things were vague and shadowy in the old dining hall. The sides were oak-panelled, and two were heavy with faded tapestry, across which huntsmen and dogs and stags were still dimly streaming. Above the fireplace were rows of heraldic shields with the blazonings of the family and of its alliances, the fatal saltire cross breaking out on each of them. And then there's also the paintings. You got
mm,
paintings of four of the ancestors. Hawk-nosed characters were staring at him. And then we find out that the walls are hollow and there are passages within, and he's
mm.
being watched. All this, it's classic Gothic stuff.
Yeah, and there's more than a hint, I think, of a bit of Hound of the Baskervilles foreshadowing in there as well, with the portraits on the wall. This lovely sequence where Baumgarten observes these four paintings and
Mm.
says um, the men are so like each other that only the dress could distinguish the crusader from the cavalier of the Fronde. And
Mm.
then suddenly a slight noise brought him to his feet. For an instant it seemed to his dazed senses that one of the pictures opposite had walked from its frame. I think it's just fantastic, isn't it?
Oh yeah, he's a master of the Gothic.
Yeah, and you're right. This is a horror. This is a haunted house, isn't it? This is a
Yeah.
this is a horror location par excellence.
Mm.
And this setting feels a lot more medieval than it does 1870.
Yeah, so you've got all this background with the chateau and the portraits and the oak panelling, the tapestries. It's all the trappings are absolutely perfect for setting up this medieval atmosphere. And then suddenly we get the Count appear in his gang.
Mm,
And again, you've got another element of kind of Gothic melodrama comes in that at the start of the story, you've got this idea of the Franc-Tireur and this very modern type of partisan warfare going on.
mm,
And then the Count appears with his group, and it suddenly there's another layer of medievalism comes in, because this is like the Lord of the Manor and Droit de Seigneur and all these
Mm,
sort of elements come in, and his gang are his feudal accomplices. And there's something of more almost of a group of medieval bandits led by their feudal lord who has lost his lands, and is avenging his lands, and we find out he's also avenging the loss of his son. So it's
mm,
the loss of the line, as well. So all this medievalism mixing in with modernity, so that Baumgarten in the end is as well as being physically maltreated by the count, he's mentally
mm,
disorientated by the whole situation, and what he thought was a modern military patrol has suddenly almost stepped back in time. That he's found himself in what feels like the 13th or the 14th century.
And the way that this story plays out is that it's really it's very biblical. It's an eye for an eye, quite literally, in the fact that Count Eustace hits Baumgarten across the face, inflicting a blow to the eye in recompense for the same blow that his son received. And the story unfolds with the Count inflicting both cruelty and kindness in equal measure. It's the kindness as well as the cruelty that really makes this feel desperately unsettling as a short story.
And makes it feel very modern,
Mm,
because you have this element where you're trying to read the count, and you read him. Is he doing this in a way that he thinks is right in his mind, with the kindness and the cruelty, or the kindness in particular just feels cynical?
yeah.
And then the count just sends Baumgarten out into the night.
Mm,
There's just this is where the story feels to me to tie in really with a lot of the French short stories, by people like Maupassant and de l'Isle-Adam, where there are no outright moral judgments
no.
being made, and it's almost up to you, the reader, to make of it what you will.
Yeah, very much so. Because I mean, you can see from Baumgarten's point of view that his men are being essentially murdered in pretty horrible ways. I mean, they're getting the
Mm,
saltire, which we've already discovered is Count
mm.
Eustace's sign, um, cut into their foreheads. You're sort of in the sympathetic position of being with Baumgarten because, like Baumgarten, you have no idea what's going to happen next. But it's not that, through the story that Count Eustace tells, we know that it's not all roses on the German side.
Yeah, and Baumgarten himself is very interesting in that sense, because he's portrayed as, he's the consummate military professional, and he is portrayed as essentially a decent man
Yes.
who, you have no doubt, has not been involved in perpetrating atrocities himself. And trying to place this story as well is a bit of an interesting game in itself, because we've talked about it as a kind of conte cruel. It's a Gothic story as well. You could almost say it's an entry in what you could class as a rather small subgenre, which is Gothic war stories.
Mm,
And Doyle himself was quite a master of this. You can see this in a number of the Brigadier Gerard stories, such as, how the Brigadier held the king, how the Brigadier came to the Castle of Gloom, and how the Brigadier joined the Hussar of Conflans,
mm,
all of which have some pretty horrific Gothic elements tied in within the wider war
mm.
story. You could also see this in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Blanched Soldier, with the waking up in the leper hospital, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
if that isn't a kind of moment of Gothic horror, I don't know what is.
Mm.
Right in the middle of the Boer War, there aren't many people were writing in this sort of field. The other two I could think of off the top of my head would be, Ambrose Bierce and P.C. Wren.
Mm.
But doing these Gothic war stories within a very identifiable historical setting, but taking them into what is in some ways an unexpected direction.
And just as we're wrapping up on the Lord of Chateau Noir, it's worth saying that Conan Doyle did actually write another story about the Franco-Prussian War, which is in a very different vein, which is called A Shadow Before. And that came out 4 years later, 1898. And it's a lovely little vignette about a trader, John Worlington Dodds, who's attending a horse auction in Ireland and deduces from the exorbitant prices being paid for horses that something is up. And he rings his London partner and tells him to sell everything that's French and German just hours before the news of the Franco-Prussian War is revealed. And it's a lovely little story. It has actually got a wonderful bit of, a classic bit of Conan Doyle setup at the beginning, wonderfully concise, which is the mighty debts of each great European power stand like so many columns of mercury, forever rising and falling to indicate the pressure upon each. He who can see far enough into the future to tell how that ever-varying column will stand tomorrow is the man who has fortune within his grasp. It's a great little story, and it's really good fun. And Owen Dudley Edwards suggests that actually this has the feeling of something that could have been suggested to him by one of those many Irish students who were studying with him at Stonyhurst as being a lived experience. But either way, it's a very light-hearted piece. It was collected with Chateau Noir in The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport in 1900, and is largely forgotten now. But it's an interesting companion piece to this, being of the same topic but completely different take, completely different feel to it as well.
And there's a lovely little touch as well, and I don't know whether it's deliberate or not, but with the fact that the part of the cause of the Franco-Prussian War was this doctored M's telegram. And the reason that Dodds in the story can work out what's going on is that the French representative and the German representative both get telegrams.
Oh, yes,
and
good
it's
point.
their reaction to those telegrams tells him essentially what's going on.
Yeah. And you spotted a connection also with the Great Keinplatz experiment.
Yes, it's Doyle doing his classic let's reuse names, because in the Great Keinplatz experiment you've got Professor Baumgarten, and in this story we have Captain Baumgarten, and we also have Captain Baumgarten's superior officer, Colonel von Gramm, who is suspiciously close to the Count von Kram, which is of course the King of Bohemia's alias in Scandal in Bohemia. And before we close, I feel that I must make an announcement here about Mark's recent investiture into the Baker Street Irregulars of New York.
Thank you very much.
As Peter Jones, who Holmes tells us is an imbecile in his profession, but Mark is most certainly not an imbecile, but he may be as tenacious as a bulldog. Or indeed a lobster.
Or a lobster.
But congratulations, Mark. Well done.
Thank you very much.
It is indeed an honour and well deserved.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it. We've got show notes, as ever, on the website. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, then please consider becoming a Patreon supporter, and there will be information about that. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
Well, I've already mentioned it in this podcast. It's his personality swap story set in the world of German students, the Great Keinplatz experiment.
Very good. Well, that really is a change of pace and tone. But we look forward to doing that next time. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. And next time, we don't know what we're doing.
We haven't got a clue.
Okay.